It is one of the most widely used metals on Earth.
The global demand for this resource, which is significant today and going to be much more significant in the months and years ahead. And to have a third of relative to the global reserves, to have a third of that resource present right here in Saskatchewan, that's a significant discussion.
Canada implemented its Buy Canadian policy, fundamentally reshaping North American aluminum trade and threatening to drive up costs for U.S. automakers already reeling from billions in tariff-related losses. The policy mandates the use of Canadian-produced steel, aluminum, and wood products in federal construction and defense procurements valued at $25 million or more, where at least $250,000 worth of these materials is required, and Canadian supply exists. The policy requires that materials must be manufactured or processed in Canada, not simply sold by Canadian companies. This ensures federal investments directly drive demand for materials produced domestically. The Buy Canadian policy applies to federal departments and agencies as well as federal grants and contributions programs and will be extended where possible to Crown corporations. Minister of Government Transformation Joel Lightbound, pronounced Joel L. Lightbound, stated that by implementing the Buy Canadian policy, the federal government is putting Canadian workers and industries first and becoming Canada's best customer. This policy creates demand across the country, from steelworkers in Hamilton to aluminum producers in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, pronounced Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. The policy represents a dramatic shift from the previous era of low-cost North American metal supply that U.S. automakers have relied on for decades. Canada is the dominant U.S. supplier of aluminum, exporting approximately $12.4 billion in aluminum in 2024, with roughly $11.2 billion destined for the United States. Canada supplies about 70 to 85% of U.S. aluminum imports in different datasets. Trade data providers recorded a 22% year-on-year fall in Canada's unwrought aluminum deliveries to the U.S. for January through August 2025, a drop of about 410,600 tons to 1.4 million tons. While U.S. premiums and Midwest spreads spiked, reflecting inventory drawdowns and higher landed costs, these moves, reinforced by tariff-driven frictions, materially tightened U.S. downstream margins for can makers, automakers, and other intensive users. The United States imposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum that reached 50% effective June 4, 2025, after raising them 25% effective March 10th earlier in the year. Both steel and aluminum going into the U.S. have been subject to 50% tariffs since June. The U.S. increased the tariff on imports of steel and aluminum products from all countries from 25% to 50%, except for the United Kingdom, which remained at 25%. Canada responded with its own counter-tariffs on U.S. steel, aluminum, and automobiles. As of September 1, 2025, the Government of Canada's 25% tariff applies only to steel and aluminum products and auto imports originating from the U.S. Canada's counter-tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain in effect as intensive negotiations with the U.S. continue. Rather than escalating a tariff tit-for-tat indefinitely, Ottawa explored industrial policies and procurement priorities that favor domestic producers and diversify export markets. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced on November 26, 2025, new measures to protect and transform Canada's steel and lumber industries, stating it is time to transform the economy from one reliant on a single trade, partner to one that is stronger, more self-sufficient, and resilient to global shocks. The temporary horizontal remission of Canadian tariffs on steel and aluminum entered into force on April 16, 2025. It provides time-limited relief to Canadian businesses that rely on U.S. inputs to support their competitiveness. However, the horizontal remission of counter-tariffs on U.S. steel used for manufacturing, processing, food and beverage, packaging, or agricultural production expired effective January 31, 2026, with the continued exception of goods used for the manufacturing of automobiles, auto parts, and aerospace products. The horizontal remission of counter-tariffs on aluminum products continues beyond January 31, 2026 until June 30, 2026 for aluminum goods used for manufacturing, processing, food and beverage, packaging, and agricultural production in Canada. The extended remission period provides more predictability to businesses as they adjust their supply chains to transition from imported sources to Canadian domestic supply. Canada also published a list of imported steel derivative products that will be subject to a 25% global tariff effective December 26, 2025. Tariff rate quota levels for imported steel products were reduced effective December 26th to 20% of 2024 levels for non-free trade agreement partners and 75% of 2024 levels for non-CUSMA free trade agreement partners. For U.S. automakers such as Ford and General Motors, sectors dependent on North American aluminum for vehicle bodies, frames, and electric vehicle components, the reduced access to low-cost aluminum means higher input costs and tighter profit margins. General Motors said tariffs cost the company $1.1 billion US in its second quarter of 2025. Chief Financial Officer Paul Jacobson stated the tariff impact for the full year could reach $4 billion to $5 billion US, though General Motors is working to offset that with manufacturing adjustments, targeted cost initiatives, and consistent pricing. Ford Motor Company announced tariffs would cost the company $2 billion in 2025. The automaker incurred $800 million in extra duties in the second quarter of 2025 alone. Chief Financial Officer Sherry House revealed the company raised its estimate for tariff costs, citing prolonged levies on goods from Mexico and Canada, as well as ongoing U.S. tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. Ford revised its 2025 earnings guidance to $6.5 billion to $7.5 billion in adjusted pre-tax earnings, down from the previously forecast $7 billion to $8.5 billion. The company suspended its annual guidance due to uncertainty around tariffs imposed under the administration of President of the United States Donald Trump, saying the levies as currently set would cost the company about $2.5 billion gross profit and $1.5 billion net profit. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated he believes the Ford F-150 and F-250 big truck series are made out of aluminum instead of steel, which is different than other cars. So the aluminum tariffs hit Ford harder. Analysts estimate that the 25% tariffs on imported steel and aluminum could add approximately $400 to the production cost of each F-150, potentially eroding profit margins or leading to higher consumer prices. While Ford sources about 90% of its steel domestically, the company relies on Canadian suppliers for a significant portion of its aluminum needs. The tariffs on Canadian aluminum imports strain the supply chain, and reconfiguring it to rely solely on U.S. sources could take years. Stellantis, pronounced Stellantis, has warned of a $3.7 billion loss in the first half of 2025, driven largely by tariffs and one-time charges, with import levies alone expected to cut about $1.7 billion from its full-year earnings. A separate study by the Center for Automotive Research estimates that U.S. automakers, including Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, could face $41.7 billion in combined additional costs as tariffs ripple through North American supply chains. Canada has responded by strengthening domestic supply links. Ottawa announced funding for Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railways to offer a 50% freight discount on interprovincial steel and lumber shipments starting in spring 2026. This makes it cheaper to move Canadian metals within the country while reducing the incentive to export to the U.S. Industry leaders warn that high U.S. tariffs are effectively pushing Canadian producers out of the American market, forcing them to seek alternative buyers abroad. In 2025, Quebec aluminum producers redirected shipments to Europe, tightening U.S. supply and driving up regional price premiums. The U.S. lacks the capacity to quickly replace Canadian aluminum. Expanding domestic production is constrained by rising power demand, which is projected to grow at 1.7% annually from 2020 to 2026, driven in part by data centers. As a result, U.S. importers remain dependent on Canadian supply and are often forced to absorb most of the cost of the 50% tariff. Ford and Alcoa, pronounced Alcoa, which operates smelters in Quebec and import the metal into the U.S., have both confirmed paying tariffs. Ford in the hundreds of millions of dollars and Alcoa about $115 million. Trade tensions are also reshaping broader economic trends. Combined steel and aluminum exports in 2025 are declining faster than during the 2018 tariff cycle. While Canadian auto production has been cut back as exports fell to late 2022 levels after tariffs took effect in April 2025. The Canadian government estimates the overall impact of U.S. tariffs and uncertainty could reduce GDP by 1.8% or about $50 billion. The greatest long-term impact may be on investment. The Bank of Canada reports firms are delaying capital spending and focusing only on maintenance. While support programs and Buy Canadian policies aim to stabilize key sectors, automakers and suppliers are increasingly considering diversifying sourcing or shifting future investments, potentially reshaping North American auto manufacturing for years to come.